Imagine a little boy, 4 years old, a time when life should be all about games, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. Now, imagine that same child found dead, his tiny, battered body abandoned like trash on the side of a lonely dirt road. He was wrapped in a cheap blanket, stuffed into a cardboard box that once held a bassinet, a box meant for the start of a new life, not the brutal end of one. For 65 long, frustrating years, he had no name. He was only known as the boy in the box, or sometimes, America's unknown child. The image of his innocent face, printed on countless posters, haunted the city of Philadelphia and gripped the entire nation. It was the oldest, most puzzling cold case they had. This is the story of that boy. It's the story of the detectives who never gave up, the volunteers who spent their lives chasing ghosts, and the incredible, modern science that finally gave him back the only thing his killer couldn't take away: his name. This is the true and tragic story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The air in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia in February 1957 was brittle and cold, the kind of deep, biting chill that seeps into your bones and stays there. It was late afternoon, around 4 o'clock, on Monday, February 25th. It all started with a rabbit trap. A young college student named Frederick, who lived nearby, was driving along a dirt service road that ran parallel to Susquehanna Road. This area was mostly woods, thick underbrush, and some abandoned farmland. Frederick had driven this road 1,000 times. He was on his way to check his rabbit traps, a common pastime back then. He glanced into the woods and thought he saw something move. A flash of brown fur. A rabbit. He knew there were traps set up in the area, and being an honest sort of guy, he pulled his car over to make sure no animal was caught and suffering. He walked a few feet into the brush. The ground was wet and muddy from the last bit of winter rain. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't a dead rabbit. It was a large, cardboard box, the kind you'd get from a department store. It was the sort of box meant for a baby's bassinet. It was beaten up, torn in a couple of places, and soaking up the dampness of the earth. Frederick stopped cold. Something was wrong. The box was taped shut, but one end was split open. He took a careful step closer and looked inside. The sight was something that would stick with him for the rest of his life, a picture of pure, defenseless tragedy. Inside the box, wrapped in an old plaid blanket, was the naked body of a little boy. Frederick froze. His mind raced. He thought about his rabbit traps, about how the police would surely come and take them away. This was a bad time for kids to be messing with animals in the woods. He did something he regretted for the rest of his life. He walked away. He got back in his car and drove home. He didn't call the police. He tried to tell himself it was just a discarded doll, a cruel joke. But deep down, he knew the truth. The horrible secret stayed hidden in the woods for another day. The next day, Tuesday, a man named Joseph, we only know him by his first name in the records, was walking through the same area. Joseph had been there a few days earlier, checking his own traps, but he was afraid of being caught by the police for setting them on private property. He was a little more careful. On Tuesday, he noticed the box too. The corner of the box was visible, and this time, he was overcome with curiosity. Joseph, unlike Frederick, walked up to the box and looked inside. He saw the same thing, the small, cold body of a child. He didn't hesitate. He immediately called the police. The Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia had always been quiet. Safe. The kind of place where nothing much happened. That quiet was shattered on February 26, 1957. When the police arrived, they found a scene that was beyond disturbing. The boy was lying on his back. He was naked. He was startlingly small, but the medical examiner would later estimate he was somewhere between 4 and 6 years old. He was severely malnourished, almost skin and bones. His body was covered in bruises, new ones and old ones, telltale signs of a beating. He had surgical scars, too, faint marks on his ankle, groin, and chin, suggesting a complicated, perhaps painful, short life. But there was something else that caught the detective's eye. Despite the awful condition of his body, the boy had been cleaned. His fingernails were neatly trimmed, and his hair, a mix of brown and blonde, had been crudely cut, almost like someone had done it in a hurry, perhaps right before he was placed in the box. Clumps of the recently cut hair still clung to his body. The box itself was a clue. It was a large, cardboard carton from J.C. Penney, the kind used to ship a baby bassinet. The manufacturer's label was still visible, J.C. Penney Company, Inc., bassinet, model number 250, size 41 inches by 19 inches by 14 inches. It was a small detail, but in a case with so little to go on, it was everything. The police were optimistic at first. A child this young, with this level of visible trauma, would surely be reported missing. They took his fingerprints. They circulated his photo. They gave him a name, just for their files, the boy in the box. But the days turned into weeks. The weeks bled into months. And no one, not a single soul, stepped forward to claim him. No missing person report matched his description. The boy in the box became an immediate mystery, a heartbreaking puzzle dropped into the heart of a major American city. The question everyone asked, the question that hung in the cold, winter air, was simple and terrifying. Who was this boy, and why had no one missed him? When the police arrived on that cold Tuesday afternoon in Fox Chase, the first thing they did was secure the scene. A small, wooded patch off Susquehanna Road became the center of a homicide investigation. The men who knelt by that oversized bassinet box were seasoned Philadelphia cops, but even they were stopped cold by the sight. This wasn't a mob hit or a bar fight gone wrong. This was a child. The boy was completely naked, which was a huge red flag. It suggested that whoever put him there didn't want him easily identified by his clothes. The body was wrapped in a cheap, plaid blanket, the kind you'd see in any working-class home in the mid-1950s. The medical examiner, Dr. Joseph W. Spellman, arrived quickly and carefully supervised the removal of the body, which was then taken to the city morgue. The autopsy was devastating. The boy, who they estimated was around 4 years old, was severely malnourished. He was painfully thin, his ribs showing clearly beneath his skin. This wasn't just a few missed meals. This was long-term neglect. His stomach was empty, but the starvation was only part of the horror. His small body was a map of suffering. There were multiple bruises all over him, some new and blue, others yellow and faded, showing that he had been beaten not once, but repeatedly over time. The cause of death was ruled as homicide by blunt force trauma. He had been struck hard just before he died. Beyond the fresh injuries, there were other disturbing marks. Dr. Spellman found several scars, small white lines that told a quiet, painful story. There was a notable L-shaped scar under his chin. More concerning were what appeared to be surgical scars on his ankle and groin. These weren't from a playground accident. They suggested the boy had been seriously ill or had undergone some kind of significant medical procedure during his short life. Investigators wondered if a hospital or doctor's office might hold the key to his name. And then there was the hair. As noted by the first responders, his light brown to blonde hair had been recently, and very clumsily, cut. It looked like someone had used a pair of dull scissors and hacked it off in a rush. Clumps of it still clung to his skin. His tiny fingernails had also been freshly trimmed. It was a strange contradiction. A child who was beaten, starved, and then, in the final hours, cleaned up and groomed before being discarded. Did the killer attempt to hide a possible identifying feature like a unique haircut? Or was this a strange, twisted moment of remorse? The police were operating on high alert. This was an unprecedented crime in Philadelphia. The very first step was clear: find a match in the National Registry of Missing Children. Detectives Sam Belloc and Harry Olson were the lead investigators, and they were confident this would be a quick case. A 4-year-old child doesn't just vanish into thin air. Someone had to be looking for him. They quickly took the boy's fingerprints and sent them to the FBI. They waited. No match came back. They reached out to police departments across the state and the country. Still nothing. The lack of a missing person report was the first real sign that this case was going to be different and much darker. The Philadelphia Police Department launched one of the most aggressive public awareness campaigns the city had ever seen. They released the famous post-mortem photographs of the boy. These weren't graphic crime scene photos. They were pictures taken after the medical examiner had dressed the child in a shirt and tie, trying to make him look like a little boy who had simply fallen asleep. The photo, with his slightly open eyes and innocent, rounded face, was haunting. Posters of the boy's face were plastered on every police station, every post office, and every lamppost in the city and surrounding suburbs. Newspapers, not just in Philadelphia but all across America, ran the story, showing the picture of the unknown child. The image was everywhere. They tried to trace the origins of the J.C. Penney bassinet box, checking stores in the area, looking through sales records, but the box was common, and the trail went cold almost instantly. The community reaction was overwhelming, a mix of shock, fear, and profound pity. People called in with hundreds of tips. They chased down stories about missing neighborhood kids, reports of suspicious vehicles, and rumors of local abuse. Every single lead was investigated by detectives who worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine and a desperate need to give this child his identity back. Was he a boy from a traveling carnival? The police checked every carnival that had passed through the area. They were all ruled out. Was he a child refugee from the Hungarian Revolution, whose parents were afraid to come forward? This theory was investigated and discarded. Was he a relative of a local family, kept hidden away? The tips went nowhere. Day after day, the hope dwindled. The face that stared out from the posters was recognized by no one. It was a terrifying realization. A child had been murdered, and no one, not his family, his friends, or his neighbors, was claiming him. It was as if he had been erased completely before he was killed. The press, and eventually the police, began to call him America's unknown child. The name stuck, capturing the heartbreaking scope of the tragedy. He was everyone's child, and yet he was nobody's. By the end of the year, the case had stalled. Every lead was a dead end. Every tip was a mistake. The boy's body, still unidentified, was eventually buried in a simple pauper's grave on November 11, 1957. The headstone was tragically simple. Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy. For the detectives, especially Sam Belloc, it was a failure that would gnaw at their consciences for decades. How could a 4-year-old boy simply vanish from the world without a trace, leaving behind only his battered body and a cardboard box? The boy in the box had become a ghost, and his nameless case, a haunting symbol of justice denied. The initial shock of the discovery wore off, but the frustration of the investigation only deepened. Detectives Sam Belloc and Harry Olson were now staring at a case that defied all logic. In 1957, children didn't just appear out of nowhere, beaten and discarded, with no paper trail. Yet, that's exactly what had happened. The police had 3 main clues: the body itself, the bassinet box, and the plaid blanket. They hit the streets, chasing down every angle, convinced one of these things would break the case open. First up was the bassinet box. It was a standard cardboard box from J.C. Penney, the kind that held a baby's folding bassinet. This was a mass-market item, but investigators reasoned that maybe, just maybe, the store could provide a clue. Detectives went to every J.C. Penney store in the Philadelphia area and the nearby suburbs. They checked sales records, trying to find who bought a bassinet in late 1956 or early 1957. This effort was a monumental failure. Back then, record-keeping wasn't digitized, and people often paid with cash. The trail was hopelessly tangled in receipts and ledger books that showed thousands of purchases. The box was common, the sale was unrecorded, and the lead evaporated. It was the first, crushing realization that the person who left the boy knew exactly how to leave no trace. Next, they looked at the autopsy findings for a sign of where he came from. The severe malnutrition suggested a home where he was kept hidden or neglected. The surgical scars, especially those faint marks indicating possible use, pointed toward a hospital stay. Detectives canvassed local hospitals, questioning staff, searching records for any young boy with similar scars or a known chronic illness. They showed the boy's post-mortem photo to doctors and nurses. No one recognized him. The fact that his hair was recently and crudely cut became a key detail. Some investigators believed it wasn't done by the killer, but by a family member who was trying to clean him up for burial, a last, sad act of care. Others thought it was done to deliberately change his appearance, to hide a familiar face before dumping the body. But the most famous and persistent early lead centered on a location only 1.5 miles from where the body was found: the foster home theory. A man named William, who worked for the medical examiner's office, had a strange tip. He was talking to an operator on the phone when she mentioned a local foster home, run by a woman known as Mrs. M in the community. The operator claimed she remembered a small, quiet, sickly boy who lived at this house in the Fox Chase neighborhood. Crucially, this boy had vanished around the same time the body was found. Detective Belloc jumped on this. The foster home was a sprawling, stone house where Mrs. M and her husband cared for various children, often taking in kids who were difficult, sick, or who had been placed there secretly. When police interviewed Mrs. M, she was cagey and unhelpful. Her story was full of holes. She claimed all the children she cared for were accounted for. Yet, local neighbors whispered about the strange happenings at the house. They mentioned seeing a boy who matched the description of the boy in the box. They talked about a strange atmosphere, a feeling that something wasn't right. The police focused on Mrs. M's house for months. They searched the property, but without a warrant, which they couldn't get without concrete evidence. Their hands were tied. They didn't find the boy's clothes or the blanket or any direct link. It was a perfect example of strong suspicion with zero proof. The police felt it in their gut, but a gut feeling isn't enough to solve a murder. A significant detail surfaced during this time. One of the foster children at Mrs. M's home mentioned a blue velvet hat. The boy in the box was never found with one, but the child insisted that a boy who looked just like the picture did wear a blue velvet hat. This detail was impossible to verify, but it added to the air of mystery surrounding the house. Another theory came from far outside the neighborhood, focusing on the boy's appearance. He looked somewhat European. Some people suggested he was part of a family who had fled the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. Thousands of refugees came to the United States around that time. The theory suggested his parents may have been hiding him or themselves, and if the boy died, they were too afraid of deportation or the police to report his death. This was a long shot, but desperate detectives checked lists of refugees. Again, it led nowhere. The constant dead ends began to wear on the investigators. Sam Bullock, a determined, square-jawed detective, took the case personally. He would carry a replica of the boy's head, a plaster death mask made during the autopsy, to all his interviews, hoping to jar a witness's memory. He'd stare at the tiny, silent face, feeling the weight of the city's conscience. The years turned into a decade. Detective Belloc officially retired, but he never let go of the boy in the box. He kept the file with him, a symbol of the case he couldn't close. He knew, as did the city, that the killer was still out there, walking free, and that somewhere, a family was still missing their child, even if they refused to admit it. The case was ice cold, frozen solid, but the image of that small, unknown face was burned into the memory of Philadelphia forever. It was a decades-long injustice waiting for a miracle. The 1960s and 1970s passed with painful slowness for the boy in the box case. The newspapers stopped running the picture on the front page, but the unsolved murder remained a dark stain on Philadelphia's history. Generations of new detectives would inherit the case file, always feeling the heavy weight of that little boy's nameless face. Then, decades later, when most of the original investigators had retired or passed away, the case got a sudden, terrifying jolt. This breakthrough, if you can call it that, didn't come from solid police work or a discarded piece of evidence. It came from a psychic and a woman in Ohio. In 2002, a Pennsylvania woman named Martha came forward. Her story was deeply disturbing, incredibly detailed, and seemed to finally pull back the curtain on the horrific life the boy in the box might have lived. Martha claimed that her deceased mother, a woman we'll call M, was the person responsible. Martha said that back in 1954, M had purchased the boy from his birth parents. This dark, unthinkable transaction supposedly took place for the equivalent of a few dollars. M lived in a small home in suburban Philadelphia. According to Martha, M was a deeply disturbed woman who kept the young boy hidden from the world. The description of the boy's life was pure torture. Martha claimed the boy was kept mostly in the basement of the home, a dark, damp place where he was subjected to constant physical and sexual abuse. He was confined, starved, and often dressed in girls' clothes. He wasn't allowed to play outside or interact with anyone, which explained why no neighbors ever saw him and why no school or doctor had him on file. He was, effectively, a prisoner. This story provided a chilling explanation for many of the original clues. The malnutrition and bruises, explained by the relentless starvation and beatings he suffered in the basement. The surgical scars. Martha suggested the boy might have been briefly hospitalized for a serious illness or injury caused by the abuse, which would account for the faint 4 marks and other scars. The lack of missing person report. His birth parents had sold him and wouldn't report him missing. M, the killer, certainly wouldn't. The timeline Martha provided was incredibly tight and seemed to match the discovery date perfectly. She claimed that in February 1957, the boy was sick and unresponsive after a beating M had inflicted. M panicked, fearing she would be caught. She took the boy upstairs and attempted to clean him up. Martha described how M crudely cut his hair to change his appearance and then carefully trimmed his nails. Martha said she was a witness to her mother wrapping the body in an old, plaid blanket and then driving out to the Fox Chase neighborhood to dump the body. This was the first time in over 40 years that investigators felt they had a solid, verifiable narrative. Detectives immediately started a new, focused investigation on M's former home. What they found was fascinating, but ultimately maddening. When police searched the house, which was still standing, they found a plaid blanket in the attic that was incredibly similar to the one the boy in the box was wrapped in. They also discovered that at the time of the murder, M owned a blue 1957 Chevrolet van, which matched the description of a mysterious van reported in the Fox Chase area around the time of the discovery. Most compellingly, the house was located only a few miles from the wooded area where the body was found. The basement was exactly as Martha had described it, the perfect cage. The detective who worked this lead, Sergeant Bob Coulmier, believed Martha completely. He felt the weight of her grief and the truth in her account. The story was simply too detailed and too specific to be a complete lie, especially since she placed her own deceased mother at the center of a murder. But here's where the lead hit a brutal snag: corroboration. Despite the matching blanket and the logical narrative, police could not find a single, independent piece of evidence to back up Martha's claim. Martha was the only witness. M, the alleged killer, was dead. The man who had supposedly sold the boy was also gone. There were no fingerprints, no physical evidence directly tying the boy to the house. Without a second witness or a piece of physical evidence to support Martha's testimony, the testimony of a person who also had a difficult past and may have been mentally unstable, prosecutors felt they could not move forward. The story of the woman from the basement became the most credible, heartbreaking, and ultimately unsolved theory in the case's history. The police had the story of the murder, but they still didn't have the boy's name, and they didn't have the unshakable evidence needed to formally close the case and declare him the killer. The lead that was supposed to solve everything instead became another agonizing dead end, showing how time can destroy the evidence, even when the truth is staring you in the face. By the time the new millennium arrived, the case of the boy in the box had become a historical artifact, a story told in hushed tones, a local legend of sorrow. Decades had passed. The original detectives were long gone. The street where the boy was found, Susquehanna Road, was no longer a lonely service road but had become more developed. Yet, the mystery remained exactly where it had started, unsolved. For the Philadelphia Police Department, the boy in the box was an enduring mark of failure. The file, thick and yellowed with age, was passed from one generation of homicide detectives to the next. Every new detective felt the pressure to be the one to solve Philadelphia's oldest cold case. But without new evidence, they were just rereading the same frustrating reports. A box, a blanket, a beaten, nameless child. The official investigation had all but stopped, but the pursuit of justice never did. The true lifeblood of the case shifted away from the police department and into the hands of dedicated volunteers and retired professionals. These were people who simply could not let the ghost of that little boy rest. One of the most important groups to take up the cause was the Vidic Society, founded in the late 1990s. This was a highly unusual organization, a club of world-class forensic experts, retired FBI agents, profilers, and detectives who offered their services pro bono, meaning for free, to consult on cold cases that had stumped law enforcement for years. Their motto was simple: to give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. When the Vidic Society took on the boy in the box, they brought a new level of expertise and, critically, new technology. They looked at the case not with the 1957 lens of shoe leather and newspaper ads, but with the modern tools of forensic science. One of their first major contributions was a huge act of dignity for the unknown child. In 1998, after lobbying the city and raising money, the Vidic Society arranged for the boy's remains to be exhumed from the original pauper's grave. It was a solemn, heart-wrenching moment. He was moved to a beautiful, more prominent plot at Ivy Hill Cemetery in the Mount Airy neighborhood of Philadelphia. They gave him a new headstone, one that reflected the city's enduring sorrow, America's unknown child. People started visiting the grave. They left flowers, toys, and small Christmas decorations every holiday season. The boy wasn't just a case file anymore. He was a silent member of the community, a symbol of childhood innocence tragically lost. The main purpose of the exhumation in 1998, though, was not just to move him to a better resting place. It was to collect DNA. By the late 1990s, DNA technology was becoming the game changer of forensic science. Investigators hoped that modern testing could finally extract a usable profile from the boy's bones and teeth, which had been buried for over 40 years. The DNA was successfully extracted, but the quality wasn't perfect. They were only able to create a mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, profile. This type of DNA is passed down only through the mother, making it less specific than the full nuclear DNA profile that modern forensics relies on. The mtDNA profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national FBI database that holds DNA profiles from crime scenes and convicted offenders. Everyone held their breath, waiting for a familial match or a direct hit. They waited, and they waited some more. The CODIS database came up empty. There were no immediate family matches. The boy in the box had vanished not just from life, but from the national genetic record as well. It was yet another devastating disappointment. The case was cold again, but the new DNA sample, though limited, was a tiny seed of hope, carefully stored away in a laboratory freezer, waiting for technology to catch up to the tragedy. The decades of the case being cold proved two things. First, that the boy's identity was a secret protected by unusual circumstances, likely a private family arrangement, as suggested by the basement woman theory. And second, that the community's devotion to the boy's memory was absolute. The volunteers from the Vidic Society, along with retired Detective Sam Bullock and others who carried the torch, kept the case alive. They held annual services at his grave. They never missed an opportunity to talk to the media about the case. They knew his killer was out there, or perhaps long dead, but they believed that the simple act of giving the boy his name was the highest form of justice they could achieve. They just needed one more scientific breakthrough, one final leap of faith, to close that dark chapter. The years following the 1998 exhumation were a time of frustrated waiting. The DNA sample, that tiny, precious bit of the boy's genetic code, sat in a freezer, silent. The mitochondrial DNA profile was a start, but it was nowhere near enough to solve a mystery this old and cold. It could only trace the boy's maternal line back generations, not pinpoint a specific, living person in a family tree. The detectives and the volunteers were stuck in a cruel kind of limbo. They knew the boy's identity was locked inside that vial, but the technology to crack the code simply hadn't been invented yet. For decades, the standard way to solve a cold case was the hard way, finding a witness who finally decided to talk, or maybe a lucky hit on the FBI's CODIS database. But with the boy in the box, the witnesses were silent or dead, and no one had ever entered their DNA into CODIS who was closely related to the boy. Everything changed around the year 2018 with the rise of forensic genetic genealogy, FGG. This new technique was a genuine game changer, shattering decades-long dead ends and cold cases all over the country. Instead of just relying on the government's criminal database, CODIS, FGG uses DNA profiles from consumer genetic websites like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. Millions of everyday people upload their genetic information to these sites to learn about their family history. Detectives realized they could upload a crime scene or victim's DNA profile into these public databases. They wouldn't get an exact match to the killer or the victim immediately. Instead, they would get matches to distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, maybe a cousin twice removed. It was like having a huge, incomplete family address book. A genealogist could then take those distant matches and start painstakingly building a reverse family tree, working backward from the matches and using public records like birth certificates, obituaries, and census data. It was essentially detective work combined with high-tech biology. The boy in the box case was the perfect candidate for this revolutionary science. The Vidic Society and the Philadelphia police agreed. It was time to try again. In 2019, A team of investigators and forensic anthropologists went back to Ivy Hill Cemetery for a solemn and difficult event, the second exhumation. This time, they needed to get a sample of DNA that was higher quality than the one they got in 1998. They needed enough material to run the massive test required for genetic genealogy, which reads thousands of genetic markers, not just the few hundred in the old tests. The challenge they faced was immense. Joseph's tiny remains had been buried in the ground for over 6 decades. DNA is fragile, and the process of decay and the presence of bacteria in the soil severely degrades it. Imagine trying to read an ancient, moldy scroll that's been shredded into confetti. That's what the forensic scientists were facing. It took the specialized lab and forensic scientists like Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick and Misty Gillis, who worked with the Philadelphia police, a grueling 2.5 years to process the sample. They had to use every trick in the book to pull a usable genetic profile from the degraded bones. They cleaned it, amplified it, and pieced together the tiny fragments of genetic code until they had a full S&P profile, the kind of detailed map needed for genealogical tracing. Finally, in 2021, they had it. A usable profile was uploaded into the public genealogy databases. The team held their breath. They knew a direct match was unlikely, but they prayed for a solid cousin. And that's exactly what they got. The results showed a clear, though distant, match on the boy's maternal side. A person, likely a cousin twice removed, had submitted their DNA years earlier to a consumer database for fun. They had no idea they were holding the key to America's most puzzling cold case. This was the break everyone had waited half a century for. The nameless boy wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a piece of a living, breathing family tree. The work shifted from a forensic lab to a detective's desk. The genealogists began building the family tree, branch by branch, moving closer and closer to the parents who had let their little boy disappear. It was a slow, agonizing process of elimination. They looked at birth dates, marriage records, and geographical locations, all pointing toward a family that had lived in the West Philadelphia area back in the 1950s. They were narrowing the focus from an entire nation to a specific household. The name of the boy, the greatest secret of the case, was finally within reach. The work that followed the successful DNA profiling was pure detective work, but instead of interviewing suspects, the genealogists were interviewing dead ends on a family tree. They had the distant cousin match, and that was the compass pointing the way. The goal now was to navigate from that fourth or fifth cousin all the way back to the boy's direct mother and father. The team, led by forensic genealogists and working closely with the Philadelphia Homicide Unit, started with the common ancestors shared by the unknown boy and his DNA matches. They painstakingly built the family's history, moving down through the generations, using every available public record from the mid-20th century: census data, marriage licenses, obituaries, cemetery records, and city directories. It was a giant, complicated puzzle with thousands of tiny, identical-looking pieces. Every time they found a potential branch, they had to confirm where that person was living in the 1950s, if they had a child who matched the boy in the box's age, and if that child subsequently vanished from all records. The process took months. The family line they were tracking centered on the West Philadelphia area, specifically near 61st and Market Streets, which placed the boy's origins much closer to the heart of the city than the Fox Chase neighborhood, where he was dumped. This was a critical piece of information. The killer had driven him across town to a secluded area, suggesting they were familiar with the city and attempting to distance the crime from the boy's life. As they got closer, the target narrowed to a specific woman who would have been in her early to mid-20s in the 1950s. She was the likely mother. To move past probability and get to 100% certainty, the police needed an official record. They needed to find a birth certificate. In a major move, the Philadelphia police obtained a highly unusual court order. This order allowed them to access sealed, historical birth records, records of any child born to the suspected maternal line during the key years of 1944 to 1956. The anticipation in the homicide unit was palpable. This was the moment of truth. After 65 years of guesses, theories, and dead ends, the answer was locked away in an old government file. When the records came back, they contained the single piece of paper everyone had searched for since 1957, a birth certificate. The document listed the baby's name and date of birth: Joseph Augustus Zarelli. born on January 13, 1953. The name of the boy's mother and father were also listed on the certificate. For the first time in over 6 decades, America's unknown child had a complete identity. The DNA had found the relatives, the genealogy had built the family tree, and the birth certificate had sealed the deal. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The emotion of the moment for the team was overwhelming. Decades of work, years of frustration, and the collective sorrow of a city came to a head in the reading of that name. Detective Bob Coulmier, who had dedicated years of his retirement to the case and championed the basement woman theory, wept when he heard the news. Lieutenant Sam Bullock, the first lead detective, had passed away years earlier, but the investigators knew they had finally delivered the answer he chased until his final days. However, the police had a new, delicate task: notifying Joseph's living family. The investigation revealed that Joseph had siblings, half-siblings on both his maternal and paternal sides, who were still alive. Many of them were completely unaware of Joseph's existence, let alone the brutal circumstances of his death and his 65 years as a nameless victim. The police needed to handle this with the utmost sensitivity, blindsiding these unsuspecting people with the news that they were related to a child at the center of a historical murder mystery. Out of respect for the newly identified family members, who had to process this shocking and painful news privately, the Philadelphia police decided to withhold the names of Joseph's parents. They simply confirmed that both parents were now deceased. The focus remained on Joseph himself. On December 8, 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department held a highly anticipated press conference. Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw stood before the cameras, her voice cracking with emotion as she announced the breakthrough. For 65 years, the story of who would come to be known as America's unknown child has haunted this community, she said. When people think about the boy in the box, a profound sadness is felt, not just because a child was murdered, but because his entire identity and his rightful claim to own his existence was taken away. And then, she gave it back. She told the world his name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The mystery of his identity was over, but the second, equally difficult chapter, the search for his killer, was just beginning. With the name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, came the beginning of a life story that had been locked away in silence for over 6 decades. The name was a key, but the door it opened revealed only a small, dim room of facts, leaving the full tragedy to the imagination. Joseph was born on January 13, 1953. He lived in West Philadelphia, near the intersection of 61st and Market Streets, a working-class area miles away from the secluded, wealthy Fox Chase neighborhood where his body was dumped. This geographical distance was a strong sign that the person who disposed of Joseph was trying to sever any link between his life and his death. What police were able to piece together suggested a short, troubled existence that likely mirrors some of the darkest early theories about the case. The physical evidence from the 1957 autopsy now took on a new, heartbreaking significance: severe malnutrition. This confirmed a life of deep neglect. Joseph didn't just have an accident. He suffered from prolonged starvation and abuse. The extensive bruising, old and new, the bruises prove that the abuse was routine, a constant backdrop to his childhood. The surgical scars, these were still a major question mark, but they suggested potential medical complications. The marks that looked like 4 insertion points hinted that Joseph might have spent time in a hospital. Was he sick, and did his parents neglect his condition? Was he being treated for injuries resulting from previous abuse? The answers were lost to time, but they paint a picture of a child who was frequently in pain and in need of serious care. The most disturbing confirmation came from the complete absence of a missing person report. The fact that no one reported Joseph missing, despite his brutal end, pointed directly to his immediate family or the people closest to them. The theory that his death was covered up, that his parents knew he was gone and actively chose silence, was now the strongest conclusion. Police confirmed that both of Joseph's biological parents were deceased at the time of the public identification in 2022. This was a double-edged sword. It meant that the person or people directly responsible for his life and death would likely never face earthly justice. But it also pointed the homicide investigation squarely toward the family unit. Investigators believe that Joseph's death resulted from the blunt force trauma inflicted by one or both of his parents or someone living in their immediate household. The circumstances of his short life, the malnourishment, the signs of confinement, the rough haircut right before he was dumped, all fit the profile of a child who was not wanted, was kept hidden, and was ultimately killed in a rage or fit of desperation. The case investigators, now free to pursue the homicide with Joseph's name, revisited old witness statements. The detailed, though uncorroborated, account of Martha, the woman from the basement, Chapter 4, suddenly became highly relevant. The police didn't formally name the mother described in that account as Joseph's biological mother, but the disturbing details of a child being kept hidden, severely beaten, and then groomed and dumped matched Joseph's tragic ending almost perfectly. It strongly suggested that the truth, or something very close to it, had been known by authorities for years but was simply unprovable without the link of his identity. The police were also extremely careful in how they handled the news concerning Joseph's living siblings. Many of these half-siblings grew up without any knowledge of Joseph. They learned their relation to the boy in the box from a phone call with a detective, a cruel and sudden injection of pain and confusion into their lives. For their privacy, and because they are completely innocent, the full details of Joseph's birth family were not released to the public. However, the identification gave Joseph's living relatives a chance to mourn the brother they never knew. It gave the community, which had held a vigil for an unknown boy for so long, a sense of closure on the mystery of who he was. On what would have been Joseph's 70th birthday, January 13, 2023, his family and the community came together. The new headstone at Ivy Hill Cemetery was unveiled. It now bears his full name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Below his name is a small, etched image of his face and the date of his birth and death. After 65 years, the tragic, forgotten little boy was finally acknowledged. His identity was no longer a mystery. But the ultimate question, the matter of justice, remained suspended, hanging heavily over his name. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli in December 2022 closed the chapter on America's unknown child, but it immediately flung open the next, and arguably most frustrating, chapter, the hunt for his killer. The Philadelphia police were now dealing with a rare scenario. They knew the victim's name, the cause of death, the probable location of his life, and the likely suspects, but they were still missing the necessary evidence for an arrest. Captain Jason Smith, commanding officer of the homicide unit, made it clear the case of Joseph Augustus Zarelli was now an active homicide investigation. The police stated publicly that they had strong suspicions about who was responsible for Joseph's death. Given the nature of the abuse, the severe malnutrition, the lack of a missing person report, and the fact that Joseph was a very young child, all signs pointed directly to the people who were supposed to care for him, his parents or an immediate caregiver in the household. However, since both of Joseph's biological parents were now dead, the path to justice became incredibly complicated. In a traditional murder case, the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator provides closure. In this case, the perpetrators were out of reach. But the police's mission didn't end there. They had two primary goals. 1. Find corroborating evidence. Even with the parents deceased, police needed to find the definitive evidence, a witness, a document, a physical clue that would officially confirm who caused Joseph's blunt force trauma and subsequent death. This would allow them to formally close the homicide file with a clear suspect identified, even if no prosecution could take place. 2. Provide answers to siblings and community. The living Zarelli siblings deserved a complete picture of what happened to their brother. The Philadelphia community, which had grieved for him for over half a century, deserved to know the full, ugly truth. The identification of Joseph immediately led investigators to re-examine every piece of the old evidence through a new lens. The focus returned to the West Philadelphia neighborhood where Joseph lived. Detectives started a new round of interviews, not to find out who the boy was, but to find out what happened in that house. They were looking for elderly witnesses, someone in their late 70s or 80s who might have been a neighbor back in 1957 and remembers seeing a young boy who was frequently hurt, or who noticed suspicious activity at the Zarelli family residence. Family associates, anyone who visited the house, distant relatives, friends of the family, or even delivery drivers, who saw Joseph and witnessed the conditions he was living in. Documentation, school records, doctor's notes, or any piece of paperwork that might detail a severe injury or hospital visit that could be tied directly to abuse. The basement woman theory from Chapter 4, which had previously been a dead end, now became a powerful lead that needed to be revisited. Detectives carefully reread the testimony of Martha, the woman who claimed her mother, M, had bought and killed the boy. They needed to determine if M was somehow directly connected to Joseph's biological parents, perhaps as a relative, or if the circumstances of Joseph's short life were simply so similar to the theory that Martha had stumbled onto a chilling pattern of abuse. The police were careful to manage public expectation. They made it clear that because so much time had passed, the chances of finding a smoking gun, a surviving, independent witness to the final, fatal beating, were slim. The passage of time meant that people's memories had faded, and the scene of the crime, Joseph's home, was long gone, scrubbed clean by decades of subsequent occupants. However, the police also offered a standing $20,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of any surviving person involved in Joseph's murder. While the primary suspects were deceased, it's possible that another accomplice, an older sibling, an aunt, or another adult who participated in or covered up the crime, could still be alive. The entire city felt the case's reopening. The media ran story after story, reminding the public that while the boy in the box was solved, Joseph Augustus Zarelli's murder was not. The sadness that had once been general, a grief for an unknown child, was now intensely specific, a grief for Joseph, a 4-year-old boy whose last hours were filled with fear and pain. The search for justice continues today. It is a slow, difficult grind against the clock and the cruelty of history. The dedication of the current homicide unit mirrors the devotion of Detective Sam Belloc decades ago, driven by the simple, powerful need to know the full truth, to speak for Joseph, and to officially name his killer. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli did more than just give a name to a cold case. It created a powerful, lasting legacy that stretches far beyond the 1957 crime scene. Joseph, once a symbol of unknown tragedy, became a catalyst for change and a face for all forgotten victims. The emotional impact of the 2022 announcement was profound. For decades, the Ivy Hill Cemetery grave, marked America's unknown child, was a place of pilgrimage for Philadelphians, detectives, and true crime enthusiasts. Now, visitors came with a new kind of grief, one tied to a real name and a specific date of birth. The annual memorials held at the grave site transformed from a vigil for the missing into a celebration of the life Joseph finally reclaimed. On what would have been his 70th birthday, a large crowd gathered to see the final, completed headstone. It read, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, January 13, 1953, February 1957. It was a simple stone, but it represented the culmination of 6 decades of determined work by hundreds of people. The small picture of his face, etched onto the granite, finally looked like the face of a loved, remembered child, not a forgotten victim. Joseph's case became a powerful national example of the potential of forensic genetic genealogy. The technology that was once too expensive and complex was now proven to be essential for solving the most stubborn cold cases. His story encouraged other police departments across the country to invest in this type of DNA testing for their own unidentified remains, giving hope to countless other families waiting for answers. Joseph's tragedy, in a small way, helped spark a revolution in cold case investigations. The work of the Vidic Society and the tireless commitment of investigators like Sam Belloc and Bob Colmier were finally validated. The story of the boy in the box became a testament to doggedness and dedication. It proved that even when decades pass and the original witnesses are gone, the truth can still be unearthed through sheer will and scientific progress. For the living Zarelli family members, the revelation was a moment of shock, sorrow, and strange relief. They had to grapple with the knowledge of their family's dark secret, but they also gained a lost brother. Their privacy was guarded, allowing them the space to mourn and process the horrifying details of Joseph's short life without public scrutiny. As of today, the final puzzle piece, the official identification of the person who inflicted the fatal blow, remains elusive. The current homicide team continues to follow up on every call, revisiting the old residential neighborhood, hoping that the knowledge of Joseph's name will jog a memory someone thought was safe to forget. Perhaps a family member who was a child at the time and is now an elder remembers something small. Perhaps an old friend of the parents will come forward with a final, incriminating conversation. The police have been upfront. They may never make an official arrest, as the prime suspects are deceased. But they are committed to gathering enough evidence to make an official declaration of the perpetrator's identity. That final step, the confirmation of the full truth, is what will bring the true sense of closure to the official record and to the hearts of everyone who followed this case. Joseph Augustus Zarelli is no longer an unknown child abandoned in a box. He is a little boy who lived, who suffered, and who, even in death, refused to be forgotten. His final legacy is a powerful one, the ultimate triumph of identity over anonymity, and a quiet promise that science and human dedication will never stop seeking justice for the voiceless. A case that reminds us of the vulnerability of children and the lengths to which people will go to cover up a horrific act. For 65 years, that little face looked out at us from posters, begging for a name, begging for someone to remember him. And thanks to a new generation of investigators and the miracle of modern DNA science, he finally has that back. But the truth of his killer remains an open question, a challenge to our collective conscience. Is there still someone out there, perhaps a surviving relative or a long-forgotten neighbor, who holds the final piece of this tragic puzzle? Someone who can finally put a full stop to the injustice Joseph endured? If you found this story compelling, please remember to like this video, comment below with your thoughts on the most frustrating part of this case, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the cold cases that shape our world. The pursuit of justice for Joseph Augustus Zarelli continues. Let's make sure his name is never forgotten again.